The richest man in the world says we have to reduce spending to live within our means. Since Donald Trump's second presidential inauguration, Elon Musk has inserted himself into the inner workings of the government through the Department of Government Efficiency, which he heads. Politicians and citizens alike have expressed concern over the power that Musk, an unelected official, seems to wield. In his most recent head-turning move, the billionaire said Americans should be prepared for some financial hardship to get back on track. Musk thinks that it's time for working-class Americans to tighten their belts when it comes to spending. In a telephone town hall with the America PAC, Musk told listeners that it was time to be more financially conscious and be ready to make some cuts, saying the reality is that there is so much government waste, kind of like being in a room full of targets you can't miss. As a country, we need to live within our means. A group of Reuters contributors reported that Musk had been involved in the buyout for federal workers that President Trump has instituted. Closely related to this is the dismantling of organizations like the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, and the Department of Education, leaving thousands of federal workers jobless. The Department of Government Efficiency is reportedly closely involved with these efforts, with Musk looking into possibly getting rid of other governmental agencies like the General Services Administration, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, Reuters reported. Musk and Trump are presenting this style of governance as something new that is going to shake up the government. These measures of government spending cuts are known as austerity measures, and they are commonplace in economies where corporate lobbyists constantly seek to unravel federal spending so that they can fill in and privatize larger swaths of the economy in order to make more profits, all at the expense of the working class. Deficit hawking is the tactic used by politicians of all varieties to essentially boil down their plan to one false premise and convince the population that cuts in federal spending will help them. Our deficit is too high, leading to inflation, making the economy worse. This is, however, a myth. There is no absolute correlation between deficit size and inflation. Stephanie Kelton, an economist and author of The Deficit Myth, has also explained some aspects of government spending in a CNBC interview. Japan, for example, has the highest debt-to-GDP ratio in the world, yet has suffered from a deflation problem. So it's important to understand that whenever a politician is calling for cuts in federal spending, they're often doing it at the behest of corporate profits, which ends up being a self-feeding cycle. Corporations then raise their prices higher for more profits, causing inflation. But instead of blaming the corporations for raising the prices, they say that it's because of the deficit and cut federal spending further, which is a self-sustaining spiral downward. The most notable shakeup in our recent history towards this trend happened with Ronald Reagan's tax cuts, and since then, wealth inequality in the United States has become as drastic as it was in the Gilded Age. Musk reinstated, most importantly, we have to reduce spending to live within our means. That does really involve temporary hardship, but it will ensure long-term prosperity. One Twitter user, known only as V, validly inquired, quote, "The man with more money than anyone else on earth says everybody's temporary hardship will be worth it. How much hardship will he endure during all this?" End quote. And the answer is none. These policies will make him and other members of the 1% richer, as they are free to privatize greater shares of our lives, all at the expense of the working class, which won't be a temporary struggle. It will be a permanent concession in addition to the dire wealth gap in our economy. It always comes down to one question: why would the richest man in the world want to do anything other than make himself richer? Now, next story covers the hysteria over the tariffs and what to expect. Here's what to know about Donald Trump's tariffs and how they will affect the American working class. AP News has reported that President Donald Trump has declared an economic emergency to place 10% tariffs on all imports from China and 25% tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico. Economists have made it very clear over the past few months that tariffs effectively work as a flat tax on the consumer, hurting the working class. James Lucier, Capital Alpha Partners managing director, said in an interview in October of 2024 with CNBC that studies consistently show that tariffs are passed on to consumers. So, how does this work? Tariffs are a flat tax that importers, i.e. American companies, pay at one of our 328 ports of entry to Customs and Border Patrol, which then goes to the United States Treasury, contrary to claims by Trump that foreign countries pay for the tariffs. In order to maintain their profit margins, those domestic companies will then raise their prices, making consumers foot the bill. Tariffs have often been used in the past in targeted ways, where placing a tariff on a specific good from a foreign country will make room for a domestic company to fill that space, promoting domestic manufacturing. This does, however, lead to trade wars, where countries will retaliate with a tariff of their own, as seen when the European Union retaliated to Trump's steel and aluminum tariffs by placing tariffs on American products like bourbon, and Harley-Davidson motorcycles. Not to mention that the chicken war in 1962 between the United States and Germany has left lasting tariffs on United States chicken and German Volkswagen trucks. Trump's incoming tariffs, however, are not targeted on specific industries. They are just a blanket on our three most vital trading partners. And our domestic American manufacturing is not strong enough to compete with tariffs on all imports from Canada, Mexico, and China. The budget lab at Yale has estimated that Trump's tariffs could cost the average consumer an extra $1,200 a year. And if history is any indicator, our economy has been on a constant trend of growing wealth inequality since the Reagan and Carter administrations. The working class has suffered through a steady barrage of austerity measures that have unraveled protections on the working class and made it far less likely for new generations to be able to afford a home or a comfortable retirement. So it is very likely that these tariffs are going to hurt an already suffering working class. And our last story covers all the DEI hysteria and how it's not what you think. HR executive has explained why revoking DEI initiatives actually prevents the most qualified candidates from getting hired. There's an uproar over diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI initiatives, and the rapid pace at which companies are getting rid of them. Many have celebrated the rollback of DEI as a triumphant return to hiring the most qualified person, rather than supposedly playing favorites, when in fact, despite what many politicians and pundits would have us all believe, fairness is the entire point of DEI initiatives in the first place. The key word in DEI is equity, fairness, and equality of opportunity. The words diversity and inclusion have been cleverly seized upon by people with political axes to grind and turned into boogeymen to convince the public that minorities have too many rights. Or something, I guess. But equity is the actual point of DEI, and it applies to everyone. It helps ensure, for example, that your state school degree doesn't hold you back from getting a job you're the best candidate for simply because the other guy went to Harvard and his dad knows the owner of the company. It's pretty basic stuff and applies to even all the rich white guys who seem to be crying about it the hardest. Our country has been run on nepotism and generational money, which has enforced the racial wealth gap as things like denying reparations for slavery and redlining has pushed against the struggle for black liberation. What did Kendrick say? 40 acres and a mule is bigger than the music. DEI essentially works to actually hire those qualified for the job over somebody who is, say, rich and well-connected but sucks at their job. This has led to the uproar where idiots will cry DEI anytime they see a black person on TV. Molly, a seasoned HR executive known online as HR Explained, recently explained this in a video, which she pointedly addressed the foolishness of the DEI uproar, saying DEI was never about hiring somebody unqualified over somebody who is qualified, Molly stressed. The point of DEI is to eliminate favoritism, not create it. DEI initiatives are meant to address bias in organizations to ensure that procedures such as hiring and pay in the case of employers are fair and unimpeded by unintended discrimination. Whether they succeed at actually doing so is another question, and that's largely down to leadership. However, DEI initiatives at least provide a framework which often includes training for addressing these potential pitfalls. That is, of course, not at all what most people seem to think DEI is. As Molly put it, DEI or DEI programs did not all of a sudden make it legal to hire somebody just because of the protected class that they're in. That bit of misinformation has proliferated in both traditional media and perhaps especially on social media, but that doesn't make it true. As Molly explained, DEI initiatives are simply about evaluating people on their merits and attempting to curb the biases that tend to obscure them. So unless you come from the Ivy League educated billionaire circles that tend to run everything by default, you are up against these biases too. Those who insist that the best candidate should be hired are actually in favor of DEI initiatives, whether they realize it or not. Molly pointedly said in response to a commenter who insisted hiring based on merit was both antithetical to and the remedy for DEI initiatives. To illustrate this, Molly focused on one kind of discrimination that every single one of us faces if we're lucky to live long enough: age discrimination. She posited an example of a highly qualified over 40-year-old candidate being rejected for a young go-getter in their 20s or 30s. That means that the qualified person isn't getting the job because they're old, Molly said. which means that discrimination, bias, bigotry existed in the hiring process, which means that it's not fair or equitable. And if that doesn't sound great to you, then congratulations, you support DEI. The very simple explanation certainly doesn't jive with the demonizing hot takes about giving preferential treatment to minorities that many politicians and pundits have been spouting. If anybody remembers the Boeing plane crash fiasco where people were blaming DEI, black people, and women with no evidence, it turned out it was profit-seeking corner cutting that gutted safety safety regulations. So misunderstanding DEI and falsely blaming it can have very dangerous consequences. If that's surprising to you, it might be time to consider why that is, then examine why you're celebrating the dismantling of programs that benefit you. Then take notice that the people you trusted to explain DEI are using their disinformation about it as a basis to dismantle worker protections of all kinds. Thanks for watching YourTango.